inside great minds, the Prosperity 247 podcast helps to make technology work better for us all. I'm Marcus Bailey, Head of Cloud in the Technical Solutions team. And today we're talking about the Azure migration. And I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Lee Pirouet. Hi, Lee.
Hey, Marcus, you all right?
Yeah, good, thank you.
Good.
So this is the first podcast we've done in a series on Azure migration. And we're hoping to make this into an overall theme that we're going to run throughout the summer. And so we're trying to deliver the message of Azure migration to you guys using our timed earned experience and practical knowledge. And we've made a few mistakes, so we're hoping to be able to help you guys understand what's involved in Azure migration and the pitfalls, how to make it right, and how to do it properly. So, hi Lee, would you mind telling us a little bit about your role at Prosperity 247?
No problem. So I've been at Prosperity 24/7 since 2011. I'm a Director of Technical Solutions, and we head up, myself and my colleague Jake, a team of 20. We work with customers to make the best of their technology across all infrastructure solutions, whether that's on-premise or migrations to the cloud, traditional storage arrays, and now down to kind of VDI desktops as well.
Great stuff. 2011, eh? Long time.
It's a long time. Life sentence.
Okay, so Azure migration, what's involved? It's actually a massive subject, so we're going to try and break it down into what we can deliver in this in the time period we've got. Each of these kind of subjects could be their own theme for a podcast, so we're going to try and give what we can, but we might not go too deep. So if you want to follow up on any points, just let us know, and we'll be happy to contact you directly.
And this is a precursor as well to a series. We're doing a series of roundtables that will dig deeper into these specific areas with customers. So if you'd like to attend those, those are coming up in the next few weeks as well.
Awesome. So if you read in Microsoft documentation, all Azure migrations really start with the Cloud Adoption Framework, what's called CAF for short. So, and that document is an exhaustive document. It's massive. It can be applied to any cloud environment. So if you want to go to Amazon or Google, but we look at it from the Azure perspective. We are not going to go into that document today because it's quite boring, it's quite dry. But if you have time, I think you should review it because most of our deployments are based on the Cloud Adoption Framework, CAF. So I don't think we're ever going to do a podcast on that because it is quite dry.
It's very theoretical as well, isn't it? So it's important to pick out the bits that are relevant to yourselves as customers.
Yeah, cool. So really, well, any project, any Azure migration always starts with discovery. Would you agree with that, Lee?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Good stuff. So I think with an Azure migration, the discovery becomes even more important just to make sure that you get a successful migration. So we sometimes start discovery like a year or so before the actual migration itself, don't we?
There's no difference really from a traditional infrastructure refresh. You've got to be ready. You've got to understand your landscape. You've got to understand the strategy of the organisation as well, and where you need to go with your technology estate. So discovery is extremely important. Don't rush it.
So there are some tools actually for discovery that we do use, and some of them are, but you can pay for some of them. But there is an Azure one called Azure Migrate, which you might have heard of, and part of that is the discovery assessment that you can run from the Azure portal, and that will run against your on-premise estate.
Mm-hmm.
And from that you will get. So it runs over I think it's 30 days that you have to do it for.
You can actually run it over, one day, a couple of hours, but if you're going to get decent metrics out of it, you've got to do it for as long as possible. I think Microsoft suggests 30 days because that shows the peaks and troughs of your usage throughout the month. So what that will give you is a list of your virtual machines and how they will look in Azure. It will kind of give you some right sizing, which is speccing up the machines in Azure because there's a whole rate of machine size in Azure. And then it should model costs for you as well. They can also put things like backup requirements in, and not RPOs, time, stuff like that, and retention periods, like that. It should give you costs on the whole Azure estate. It can also do things like SQL databases or application migrations and assessments into Azure, but we're really focused on VMs into Azure at the moment and how that looks. So have you used that in a practical? Absolutely. So we've done it a couple of ways. When we were starting on this journey, we ran it ourselves. We run it across multiple customers. Some of the data is quite tricky to pick out. So I think cost sizing is so critical in cloud assessments. I think sometimes there's a bit of an assumption based out of these tools. So there's a couple of ways to do it. You can do it yourselves. You can work with a partner like ourselves to run the tool, or we can actually, as a Microsoft Gold partner, we can get a Microsoft-led funded assessment. The challenge with the different routes on this is it all depends on the understanding you've got of your own estate. If you don't understand your own estate, you really need someone to come and pick through the bones of it to work out, actually, is that a realistic cost? Is that a realistic assessment for those particular workloads? We work successfully with Microsoft when the customer themselves is able to input into the assessment, or when we have that knowledge of the customer environment to really provide that feedback.
Yeah, and it's so important that you do run a tool, because modeling in Azure is really important, because there's no point in saying to your business that we're on the edge of a infrastructure refresh and it's going to cost.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Which is most of the time we actually go into customers and they just don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, it could be tens of thousands of pounds a month, and that could be like £250,000 to £500,000 a year. And it's a lot of money if you don't understand what it's going to cost you in Azure.
But I think that's actually a fear factor as well, because a lot of people do. There's a natural assumption, and there was from us as well before we kind of went down this journey, probably 5 or so years ago, that the cloud's really expensive, and it's not if it's done right.
Yeah, that's the important bit, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And then, so when you work with someone like us, a partner, the Azure Migrating will give you, like we said, right size and recommendations. So it will say this machine here it should be this size. But in real world examples, we've tweaked them down a bit, haven't we? Save costs, and we've given them as accurate we can be, sort of estimated cost that's going to be out for that year.
And that's all about understanding the estate, understanding the application requirement.
Yeah. So that tool we do run, okay, and that will give you a lovely report. And like Lee said, you can run the partner-led assessment that will give you also a very granular report. That's great. So you can kind of get those modelling costs and you can understand what it looks like in Azure. But then there's a sort of practical side to the discovery we find that has to be done by both the partner working with you as a business leader or the decision maker. And we really find that's really important to start to get an understanding of your digital estate, your on-premise digital estate. We normally start with the applications, don't we?
I mean, that's the most critical thing to the business, isn't it?
Yeah.
If that doesn't work, you can't function as a business. So definitely that's the way to go.
Yeah, so we're asking questions like, can you list out your core business applications? How do end users interact with those? Do they have a fat application on a laptop, or is it via Citrix? What's the life cycle of that laptop? Applications. Sometimes we see applications that are due to be retired or moved to a SaaS-based application. So if you can get not modeling, but a complete understanding of your whole digital estate, of the applications, and then the VMs and the SQL servers and stuff that underpin those applications, I think that's in my mind, that's probably the most important step in the digital estate kind of documentation.
Yeah, and the mistake we see sometimes is people believe it's just purely a IT technology-led discovery phase, but realistically, you need a full understanding of your application stack. There's always applications that IT don't seem to know about.
Yeah.
So actually, a business analyst within the business or a third party is always useful in that kind of phase.
And some of the more complicated migrations, we have had business analysts come in and document and define processes just to ensure that application 1 can't be lifted to the cloud and application 2 is left on premise, and that they need to interact. And it's so important to the business that they can talk to each other. So that's really, really important, that side of it.
This whole piece will determine how you progress within the later stages, because there's multiple ways to cut this. Yeah,
and that's why maybe a discovery can be done a year before. You could do a soft discovery, and that will give you a better understanding, because it can take a while. We find that anything involving vendors and costs can slow projects right down. Yeah. It's always the applications that seem to be the issues in migrations. We can always get a VM into the cloud, but we can't sometimes move applications safely into the cloud. And sometimes we see Exchange on premise, don't we?
Yep.
And then we might recommend you do an Exchange online migration.
It's the first logical step. If you're going to the cloud, why do you need to have your mail data held in your own server? You're already adopting those cloud processes, so it makes the whole transformation easier.
Yeah, you don't have to lift up a massive Exchange server with backup, stuff like that. So
not to mention all obviously the benefits you get with
being in
M365
that
around that.
ecosystem sort of thing. So that's a project in itself. So that might be done 6 months before you go to the cloud, etc., etc. And then other things like SQL servers, supported operating system. You can't stick a 22003 VM if you've got any of those lying around into Azure.
We probably shouldn't be having this discussion.
We do see them though.
Yeah, they do exist. Yeah.
And then sometimes we do a home drive to OneDrive migration to help ease the burden. So there's loads of sort of application and data discovery and decisions that you can make before you start to even think about moving things.
And that's a cost-saving exercise as well, because you get your free storage within your M365 licenses for OneDrive. So why would you be paying again to store it in Azure?
Exactly. And in the discovery, we also find that building the kind of migration team, who's in the migration team, and then who's your stakeholders, who's going to be decision makers. You start to build that team early on, so you've got that momentum going into the Azure migration. That's in the CAF, but I won't mention the CAF again. Well, I might do.
You definitely.
Yeah. So we've done the discovery. We've done it a year before, let's say, and then we've done a soft discovery a year before. Everyone's on board. We're going to run it again 3 months before we go. So now we're kind of looking at decisions to be made for migration, and some of those in the discovery, and the CAF, I'm afraid to say again, is what's called the 5 R's of rationalization. So I'm going to read them out to you, and then we won't mention it again. So there's rehost, which we call lift and shift; refactor, which is to move an application to something like PaaS; re-architect, which is to rebuild an application cloud ready; rebuild the application from scratch, or replace the application, which is chuck it in a bin. So we see some of those more often than others, don't we? I think
we do. I think we've seen all of them. It really does depend on the complexity of the estate. So, if we're talking about a 100-user business with kind of 3-4 line of business applications, I think in that scenario, a lift and shift rehost type approach works pretty well. Does depend on kind of legacy systems and things on those lines.
Estate, stuff like that.
Completely. A refactor move to PaaS. I think that's the way everyone is going. PaaS and SaaS as well, but that's a bigger piece as well, because you've got to look at your line of business applications and what can change. But that can come along as part of the process as well. Re-architect, not seen so much. We don't tend to get involved.
Not in our size deployments.
No, absolutely not. Rebuild, absolutely. Obviously, whether you have the skills in-house or you need a third party to help with the actual specific applications, that is a clean approach. It obviously will get you off legacy operating systems, legacy systems. It will require additional testing. That will be critical. But that's, and there might be an element of rehost and rebuild as well. It's not one size fits all. Replace rarely happens, but often there is a roadmap to change applications, and if a new SaaS application is coming online, then if you can fold that into the project, why not? It's just one less thing to move.
I think the most successful migrations I've seen is a combination of all. So they've kind of rehosted what they can't get out, and they put it into Azure. They've refactored what they can into a SaaS or PaaS-based application. So that's kind of the roadmap for most applications now. Well, not most. Sorry, that's a bit of a generic statement, but if you can get it out and put it into someone else's environment, pay that cost, that's fine. And then filling out your estate by reviewing applications and asking questions like, why have we got that? Who uses that? Do we need that? Can we get rid of it and replace it with a better application? And that way you can kind of lift what you have to into Azure and then get rid of what you don't.
It's about cost again, isn't it? Making sure that actually you're not just taking stuff you don't need. But I agree.
Yeah, cool. So we've completely done the migration now. We've worked out every application. So we're actually going to do the discovery, and now we're going to do the migration. Okay, so there's some migration tools that we do use, some we shouldn't as well, we can talk about.
Well, I don't know if you want me to jump in. So Azure Migrate is the tool we mentioned before about doing the discovery. That is Microsoft's official migration tool.
Yeah.
It will lift those applications from on-premise and put them up into Azure. What we've actually seen quite a lot of is been a transition for customers. So they haven't necessarily just leapt from production into cloud. They've taken the decision to test out the Azure platform effectively by using it as their DR, the disaster recovery platform. So in that scenario, what we've done is actually, if they have a secondary DR site, or even if they don't, we've replicated their virtual machines using Azure Site Recovery, which is the disaster recovery
Could be another podcast as well. But.
Could be another podcast completely on its own. But we've used that to kind of build the process, get the virtual machines, get the copy of the virtual machines up into the cloud, and tested the failover, make sure it works, make sure it gives you a repeatable and a testable DR platform. And then from that point, down the line, they've made the decision to actually flip it into live. So then we've used that disaster recovery replication to actually put it into live.
So that's Azure Site Recovery. And that is actually what's underpinning Azure Migrate. So it's the same tool, but Azure Migrate might give you a little bit more functionality. But ASR, Azure Migrate, they do work really well, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, so ASR is really on a virtual machine level, or a physical machine level. The whole server itself, it doesn't. Azure Migrate will delve deeper into things like SQL database.
It can do all those stuff. We don't see many migrations yet from SQL to SQL, do we? SQL to the PaaS offering.
I think if people aren't taking the server, they generally will actually look at a migration of those specific services rather than using Azure Migrate.
They can do it, and Microsoft have done a really good job with those tools. To be fair, they've worked really well. They've been robust. I mean, because it's quite stressful doing a migration. You've got a limited time window. You don't want anything flaky. And they do work. And we've been able to fail them into sandboxes and test and failover.
You need a testable process, and you need the users to be able to test with it in the cloud without affecting production.
And it's cheapish. It's not free because you have to pay for the storage while you're migrating, but it's cheapish. So I think it's 5 or 15-minute RPOs, so it's pretty good. It's worked well for us. We've failed our whole estate using that.
As a DR solution on its own, that is a massive cost saver. If you're removing the cost of, if we're talking channel islands, but data centers, in-site connectivity, all sorts, you're only paying for the storage in Azure. It's a cost-effective way.
It's changing the way that sort of infrastructure refreshes have been. That's not fun. We'll move on to so we know the technology now. We're going to use Azure Migrate, and so we what we call a strategy for migration. So these are made up terms. We go big bang, piecemeal, or hybrid, really, don't we? We see those kind of things. Have you used any of those in practical examples?
Absolutely. So, but it all depends on size. It depends on application landscape. The big bang approach, which effectively means just picking a weekend, picking an out of hours time, failing everything over, getting users logging onto the new system in Azure. That works for smaller sizes. So small SMBs, when the application landscape is not particularly large and it's easily testable. Other than that, your next one was piecemeal, to take services at a time. That works well as well, because as long as you base, I think one thing we haven't touched on, there's an assumption here, is in Azure you can base your data wherever you want. So there's regions all over the world. So we tend to, our clients' data tends to be in Europe or in the UK. And the connectivity back to kind of Channel Islands, UK is decent. So you are actually able to run workloads across both sites. So that piecemeal approach, as long as you've got decent connectivity, which we certainly do in the Channel Islands, allows you to actually run some services.
When we're piecemeal, we're talking about temporary time period where we might take some apps and then take the next, or and leave some on-prem, and then have to have some interactive, or the users are still maybe using Citrix or something like that on-premise. And going across those links.
Or even vice versa. We've seen the other where people are using VDIs, Citrix. That's a massive workload burden on premise. They've actually decided to take that up to Azure first and actually get the users there coming back to it.
Sometimes we've seen that to alleviate the biggest problem is performance in VDI, isn't it? And then we've seen customers go to Azure to alleviate their problems and then access the application.
Suddenly realised that it's actually their on-premise hardware that was the issue.
And so hybrid is actually a strategy to exist both in Azure and on-premise for unlimited amount of time.
I think we're going to have customers that will be in that state for a long period.
Especially in Channel Islands with data sovereignty and stuff like that. So those migration strategies, they will be fleshed out towards the end of your migration, and you'd have to get them agreed by your business, and they will drive other decisions, things like do we have to get different links put in, which we can talk about in a second as well, and how do we access those applications, what technology sits underneath that, is it Citrix or Azure Virtual Desktop?
I mean, one thing to think about those, in traditional infrastructure deployments, new infrastructure refreshes, the decisions you make are going to be there for the whole length of the project.
Yeah.
The difference with a cloud migration is actually you can pivot.
Yeah.
The time to be able to change direction, spin up something new, actually go down a different route. You haven't made that capital investment in something that necessarily wasn't right at that point.
Yeah, that's a really important point because people who use the cloud to the best of their ability have always evolved with the technology, if you know what I mean? So it's a continual cycle of mainly cost management, security and reliability. But you do have to constantly make sure you're using the technology to the best because Azure will come with new features, take features away. So it's always around cost, reliability and cool. Okay, so we'll just quickly touch on network, that's all right, because it is critical, isn't it, in both the migration and the long-term strategy.
I mean, that is going to become effectively all of your offices will become remote sites. There's different ways you can connect into Azure, but that redundant and high-performing connectivity will be the success criteria. Really.
So, I mean, moving to Azure can mean that you're dropping MPLS links between your hub site to your remote sites on premise. So you're going to take back those savings, completely redefine your network. Those kind of things have to be factored in. You might have contracts with your telcos and stuff like that. So we do see that we don't get too involved with that, but what we do get involved is the throughput for migration and then the throughput to live in a hybrid state, don't we? And then there's some options for clients around. So we do see Express Route, don't we? I think I'm going towards.
Oh, we do see Express Route. 4 or 5 years ago, it was prohibitively expensive. But now, so Express Route is a direct connection. It's effectively your own private link, although it's over shared infrastructure. It's your own private link into your cloud environment. So it's a dedicated link. You're not pushing your traffic all over the internet.
You guarantee bandwidth, don't you?
So
we see that for hybrid.
Guaranteed bandwidth, guaranteed latency.
We need people that need to guarantee that an application can talk to SQL Server and the throughput's going to be up to date.
But that's from your data center into the
Azure. So, but I mean, a lot of our clients are running on fiber broadband and VPNs.
So where Express Route fits really well is if you are in that hybrid state. So you've got workloads in both environments. Whether you need Express Route just for user access is up for debate. It does depend on your organization. If your users are just accessing all of the data straight out of the cloud, then actually just redundant connectivity over high-performing internet.
That's the model we've seen
pretty well.
And we've got a team that's Prosperity that are helping to roll those networks out. So
and redundancy is key, right? So you've got to make sure that even if you're taking from multiple suppliers, your connectivity, that it is actually truly redundant.
You can ask questions about the actual physical delivery of fibers into your building, and then how that works out between different telcos and stuff like that. So one of the other things related is to network is how you migrate the data. So we have been putting if they're going to bring if you're thinking about bringing a new link that's going to be your link to Azure, we've been dedicating that for the migration bandwidth, haven't we?
Because you're putting a lot more strain on your outbound connectivity. So what you don't want to do is impact your kind of existing
terabytes of data up a link. And you can do that with something called private endpoints in Azure, which is another podcast on itself again. But you can tunnel or force your migration traffic up a dedicated link and straight into Azure. So that's worked really well for us on clients as well. Relatively cheap as well. Cool. So I think that's covered network. The only thing maybe we talk about is the way you sort of structure your network in Azure. And so following the CAF, with the Cloud Adoption Framework.
You said you weren't going to say it.
I know, sorry. The CAF keeps it into something called the well-architected framework in Azure, which is a kind of not a blueprint. It's a set of standards that Microsoft recommends, and a lot of it is around network because the network will dictate things like regions and stuff like that. And we move towards the hub-spoke network deployment, don't we?
Yeah. So I think one of the things we saw in the early days of Azure adoption is it's very easy to get a network set up and get a virtual machine built in that network. But people were kind of neglecting the traditional security practices they'd use on premise. So they were putting workloads in the cloud, but they weren't necessarily using the same kind of enterprise class firewalling
Yeah.
or anything along those lines in Azure. So yeah, that's why we've kind of looked at the hub spoke framework.
And these security in Azure, along with cost optimization, so that is massive because you've lost that physical security. You can't lock your server in a server room anymore. You're putting your data in someone else's data center, and so there's a document as well. What Microsoft will tell you is your responsibility. So it's really important that you look at securing your environment.
Your level of encryption, your level of firewalling. One of the negatives, I suppose, with the ease of Azure and the ability to do things quickly is you can expose your data to the internet if you don't know what you're doing.
But Azure actually does some good job with some tools as well, from Azure Advisor and the Microsoft 24 Cloud, where it will recommend, it will flag, and it will give you alerts and recommendations to where you're not really aligned to their architecture framework.
Yeah. And they will flag if you're doing something silly as well.
Yeah. And that's why you do need a partner to help you migrate to Azure, because us and all partners do see a lot of good, bad practices. We've made mistakes. So working with someone is going to help you make sure your environment's secure. Yeah. And continually secure, so like we said, the evolution. Cool. So we can't migrate now. We decided on migration, but we can't actually migrate anything until we built something called the Azure landing zone. So that's in the cloud adoption framework again. It's in the ready part, I think. So it's actually probably one of the most well-known and probably well-used parts of the Azure framework. So what actually is a landing zone?
A landing zone is, at the basic level, it's obviously your networks and elements where you're actually going to put your data and building that framework of what your environment's going to look like. But it goes much further than that. So it aligns to, you apply policies, security controls, and you actually it is a fundamental design of your environment.
You're making decisions like regions, like I said, network deployments, cost optimization strategies, setting budgets, like what's called guardrails, which is where you could say, I don't want anything deployed outside my primary region, or I don't want these size VMs deployed, or...
That's security principles, but also cost management principles as well. And actually you mentioned region there. That's one thing that is important to consider, because that's not just an IT decision again. You've got to look at your corporate structure, you've got to look at your clients, there's got to be buy-in from compliance of where actually
massively important
where this data is going to be.
So you also build, it's basically everything. So you build things like how will you back up your data? How do you make your backup data resilient and redundant? So do you replicate that for another region? Do you replicate to another region? What is your DR strategy in Azure? So that Azure landing zone is basically everything in a nutshell, from your discovery to your migration, all the way up. What we do, we will give you a document once we've done a discovery with you, won't we?
Yeah.
And that will be an Azure landing zone sort of overview, and then a detailed deployment. Then you could use that deployment to deploy infrastructure as a code, or deploying it manually through the portal.
Yeah, and we've got from experience and kind of going through this process with Microsoft as well. We've got standards that we will say, yes, you have to do this.
Yeah.
Realistically, if you're not doing this, you've got to accept, and you've got to explain why. But there's other bits we'll work with the customer to actually, identify how that should look and what those security practices should be.
It's different for everyone, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You see people that don't want DR, or they're really security conscious, so it changes that sort of landscape, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And if silly things like naming conventions, having that pre-mapped out and pre-planned with proper what's called resource groups, which are logical containers for articles in Azure. So it's important. So we can get funding, can't we, for some Azure?
Absolutely. So as a Microsoft partner, we're on programs where we can apply for funding on the customer's behalf. Where Microsoft will actually pay a portion of the professional services and migration costs, and potentially even give some Azure credits and things to do proof of concepts and things on those lines.
Part of the landing zone is actually something called an Azure subscription, which is where you deploy your everything in Azure, basically. You can have multiple subscriptions, but so
that's the bit that you're going to pay on. That's what tells you how much it's costing you.
And to get a subscription, you can put your credit card in Azure, or you can do something called CSP, right?
Yeah.
And so we're a CSP partner, of course.
Cloud service provider.
Yeah. and then we will give you a monthly bill on your Azure usage, so you'll pay for the month before. So at that point, it's really good. You'll have a relationship with a CSP provider, and it's good to choose your CSP provider well, isn't it, right now?
Yeah, select us.
Yeah, because you're kind of not stuck with your CSP provider, but once you've got a subscription, you can't move, can you?
You can't change the subscription to another partner, and you can't take ownership of it. You can move your resources out of that subscription, but it's not just the case of just a tick box. And there is actually some manual migration of services and some services that can't move. Yeah. But it's perfectly doable. So I think the important thing is to stress you're not locked into a partner, but I think it's also important to work with a partner that you understand and trust, rather than just...
I think that's my point there. Shall we say it's not just a billing relationship, because we will talk to you about your Azure usage. We will flag high costs. We will review your estate. We will make sure that you haven't lost tens of thousands 1 month and stuff like that. And then we will, like I said, we'll help you on that sort of evolution journey.
We have regular catch-ups with Microsoft and distribution as well, and they will review the subscriptions and actually look at security practices from a high level. They can't dig right into your environments, but they look at basic things and they will flag whether certain subscriptions haven't quite configured security practices correctly. So that's stuff that we can feed back to customers as well. Yeah.
So I think it's just choose well, isn't it? Yeah. And then try and have that sort of great partnership with a CSP provider.
I think you made the statement before there. It's not just a billing relationship.
Yeah, good stuff. Okay, cool. So that's kind of it then. We've only running out of time slightly, haven't we?
I think we've covered a lot.
Yeah.
I think from my point of view, it can be quite scary coming into this cold. We've our successful migrations. I think the first conversations we've had with people are a bit reticent. There's always been that. Let's look at on-premise as well, and it's difficult to compare apples with apples. So if you're going on this journey, it is important to get that understanding of what it's going to look like.
Yeah. How much it's going to cost.
How much it's going to cost. But don't just use the Azure calculator and just flag up a high-level cost.
It's not apples to apples, is it? Because you're re-engineering, re-architecting, you're getting a modern environment.
Yeah, I mean, I hate the phrase return on investment, but you're not having to look after physical servers anymore. Yeah. You don't, we're seeing supply chain issues. Yeah. Left, right, center. If you've got something coming down the line, a new project or whatever, you can spin up resources on the fly. Those type of things are difficult to quantify. Yeah. It is the way. As organizations grow, as they become global organizations, actually having a central cloud model enables, it supports M&A, it supports
deploying into integration. Yeah,
absolutely.
We've seen that kind of agility, haven't we, in lots of times in practical examples.
Without doubt, yeah.
And so I think I would just say, do your discovery, do it really, really, really well. Put more than you want, more time than you think in your discovery. Yeah. Make sure you get everyone in your organization on board. Test and test and test.
Yeah, we probably didn't say that enough.
Test again.
Yeah.
So roll it into sandboxes, do a UAT. We've seen it where people have got like 5-10 people testing, and then we've gone to go live, and it's
just not enough. You've got to prove that your business they will work. It's just there will be snagging. There will be things that need
something like printing doesn't work, or passing card readers through. So just test again. Test during your migration. Test on a Monday morning. Make sure you've got a good partner, and that's it. I think really.
I think so.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this podcast. Thanks, Lee, for attending.
Cheers, Mark. It's been fun.
It's a wrap.